Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Dr. Marcus Hall, author of Our Bodies, Our Planet, Parasites, History of Us, published by Reaction Press. And as he and I were discussing, it's a great press. I've really enjoyed interviewing authors whose books appear on their front list. And the book will be released later this month in the US. And Dr. Hall has also authored or co-edited Earth Repair, A Transatlantic History of Environmental Restoration, and then Restoration and History, which talks about our usable environmental past, Nature and History in Modern Italy, speaks for itself, and I can't pronounce it, Mosquitopopia. The place,
Mosquitopia, let's call it.
yeah, it's because I want to say mosquito.
We made the word ourselves, so
I know it's a tough one, and that's about pests, which I consider them pests in a healthy world. But today, we'll delve into what is a fascinating take on the hidden life of parasites, things that we don't like to talk about, worms, flat or hooked, that live in our bodies that in New Guinea they would take out by taking a little piece of it and winding a piece of wood, and you'd be walking around for weeks as they turned it slightly so it wouldn't rip in half. I remember that from reading it as a kid. It disgusted me. The idea of walking around with the wood on the outside. And then, the outside parasites, the maggots and the leeches, some of whom have turned out, like many of the parasites in the book, to be helpful as well as harmful. So yeah, parasitism is not only about disease and the concept of the freeloader. Over deep time, Dr. Hall argues that these parasites, because they don't kill us, they need us. They've helped shape human health, our ecosystem, and even civilizations like Mexico. So we'll walk through, if we have time, the chapters of the book, unpacking, I guess, what it means to view human history. I didn't understand the title. I do now. An environmental change from the parasitic vantage point. So welcome, Marcus. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much. It's great to be on the show, and I am honored to be part of your long list of great titles and wonderful authors. So great to be here. I hope I can convince a few people that parasites are interesting and worth reading about. And here's the title. Here's the book, as long as I've got it here in front of me. It comes out about the middle of November, as far as I know, in the US. It's a London publisher, Reaction Books. And so, yes, it's really a book that tries to look in both directions with parasites, both we looking at them and them looking at us. And so it might be considered an animal studies book, because there's a huge turn to animal studies these days. And I'd like to think of this as yet another or a contribution to animal studies. But my own background is I'm trained as a historian with a lot of biology, and I spent my life teaching courses and doing research in environmental history, so the relationships between humans and nature. And one of the trends these days in my field of environmental history is to look at how other organisms, animals, or trees or plants, somehow what are our relationships to those, and how have we changed them, and how have our ideas in turn reflected off of those things and changed our own lifestyles. So this is really what environmental historians are trying to do. So this book then takes up the issue of parasites, and I realized that parasites is not going to be the first thing that people want to read about. It might be a conversation stopper for a lot of people, and they look at the title and say, well, this is interesting, but I don't want to get deeper into parasites. They're squirmy, they're gross, and they often get us sick. And they're all of those things, but there are a lot more I hope to convince readers in the 7 or 8 chapters that I have here. And it's I see this as I constructed this as a series of chapters that tries to be a single narrative and a single story that keeps people page turning. And so it's in a way maybe a strange book for a historian to write, but nonetheless, that's my background. And I think of these creatures as having a history and our relationships to them as changing over time. And so that's what I really explore in the book. And I go from the very small to the very large. And that's where a parasite's history of us comes in, our bodies, our planet, because then I begin to think about not very in much detail, but I can't resist touching upon it as humans in sort of a macro parasitic role. And if humans themselves are parasites, then what is our host other than the whole earth that we live on? So I make a case for trying to look at the earth as a host and go on from there.
I always say this, but as a bookseller, because even though it's a cliche that you can't judge a book by its cover, pretty much everybody who comes to my store judges every book by its cover. It's a great cover, but the title doesn't indicate. If it wasn't for the subtitle, you wouldn't know it was about parasites. And that's what you were just talking about, how it's our planet that's really affected by them. And then the subtitle indicates that it's going to be about parasites. And the best part of the cover is the parasite who's wiggling, if you will, behind the title. Who is that?
That's a tapeworm, and a tapeworm. It's from an 19th century engraving that Reaction, the publisher, found. We played a long time with different possible covers, and came up with this one. It had to be historical, and my publisher rightly said there has to be history in the title somewhere. And the reason why the keyword here is in the green is about parasite, and so you have to be willing to read the whole title of the book in order to get what the book's going to be about. And so it was an interesting um, um, sort of cognitive struggle to try to figure out what to call this and to try to put it into one piece. But I think it does a good job finally in capture what I'm trying to do with the book.
It's interesting that I find my readers, my customers, really like subtitles. They look at the title, but then that colon is what gets them. So the subtitle is what really drew me in. Obviously, when I look at the front list of Reaction, I stop for certain reasons. And when I see parasites, whether that's good or bad about my own psyche, I said, oh, yeah, I got to interview this guy. It's Parasites. And it's funny too, because in the preface, rather than talking about the science, you talk about your mom in a story that's actually related by your grandmom. So tell a little bit about that, because that gives us a little, background into maybe why you started writing this book.
Well, yeah, I start off with an anecdote about my own family experiences with parasites. And as a little boy, I used to listen to my grandmother tell this story about how my own mother would once caught parasites, and so she would sort of laugh and use this as a demonstration of what a tomboy my mother was. And the assumption back in those days, they would quickly take you to the doctor, and you'd be administered some sort of medicine to expel the parasites. And of course, they all wondered where my mother got these parasites. And my grandmother loved dogs and collies, and so the assumption there was that it was the family dog who gave my mother the parasites. But the punchline was that they went to the veterinarian and the dog didn't have parasites at all, or at least those parasites. And so it was a nice way to start the book, but it wasn't the reason why I started the book or thought about the book. Um, that really goes to the issue of looking at malaria. I've done a lot of studying
Yeah.
research on malaria and where malaria is coming from, history of malaria, and one of my research areas has always been Italy. I'm based in Europe now, and so I've written a couple of books about Italy and the Italians in certain parts of Italy. It's had a very long and brutal experience with malaria. And so really this book is about looking at the role of malaria in human affairs. But I'm trying to do this not so much as a, as a disease historian to look at malaria through the ages, but to try to figure out what malaria has done to humankind besides get it sick. And malaria is a great subject for parasites because it's caused by a very small, they call it a parasite classically, so parasitologists do study the malaria microbe called Plasmodium. And so then Plasmodium has been heavily studied over the decades, and it really serves as sort of I think the key point to the rest of the book is looking at the history of malaria and the history of the creature responsible for malaria, and then this relationship between Plasmodium and people and mosquitoes. My other book was about mosquitoes, so this actually the mosquito book, the Mosquitopia book, led into this book as sort of a prolegomena to this book. And finally, in fact, that one, the mosquito book, interjected itself while I was writing this one, and then I finally get back to this one. So it's
I think you say,
mosquitoes.
I think you say in the YouTube video to your host, not in the parasitic sense, your host, but but you say something like malaria has killed more people than pretty much anything, which I didn't know, unless I've gotten it wrong.
Those are estimates because it's been such a brutal disease and has been with humans, Homo sapiens, for so long. They're estimates that malaria has been the most cruel disease of all, and it has killed more people across humanity's existence on Earth than any other. So every disease historian likes to think of their own particular microbe as being the most important, whether it's pneumonia or tuberculosis or one of those, but certainly malaria ranks very high on the list. So it has this very long, brutal experience with humanity, and so our bodies have co-evolved with this microbe, and that's part of what I get into a bit through the evolutionary mechanisms of dealing with this malaria parasite. Uh,
It's interesting because after I read the preface, then the first, well, the chapter titles are somewhat whimsical and funny, but the first one chapter is Sardinians do it longer, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, parasites, what does that have to do with Sardinia? And it wasn't until I delved into the chapter. So talk a little bit about that and why you made it your first chapter too.
Well, I focus a bit on Sardinia, the island, and it's a great place to start a story about malaria and parasites because the experience of malaria in Sardinia has been so brutal, so rich, and so long. It's really probably one of the most important sort of stories or aspects when you talk about Sardinian history. You have to talk about malaria and how malarial the people were and how they dealt with malaria, how they built their houses up on high bluffs or windy bluffs to blow away the bad air. And then in the 20th century, how there were continual um, um, remedies and different pharmaceuticals bombarding this, both the mosquito and the plasmodium. And so it's been a long story of Sardinian heritage is dealing with malaria. And so, but one of the other really, malaria is a part of the story in Sardinia, but Sardinia has a number of other accolades, a number of superlatives. And one of the most interesting is they talk about the enormous longevity. People live for huge numbers of years in Sardinia, and demographers have traveled there to try to figure out why. But there's almost never any sort of talk about the coexistence of this long history of malaria and this proclivity to live long lives. And it's this very bizarre paradox. And so that's really how I start the book, is the paradox of having malaria and also living longer lives. What is going on there? Is this is just a strange correlation, or is there actually a causation?
It's interesting that I should mention that the illustrations, the photographs, the graphs really help and the end notes as well really help understanding the entire topic. And the map of Sardinia, where you show the black area, that was really shocking because it's just all black.
Black denoting malarial
Yeah.
numbers and numbers of people with malaria. So exactly, I probably should have put a better map of Sardinia in there. That was sort of a sketchy map, but I'm assuming people can locate malaria in the middle of the Mediterranean, and then from there, malariologists then would love to tabulate how many people had malaria and how severe it was. And it became a really important test site for Italian malariologists, but also people from overseas, because because people had malaria so severely on this island. And one would say, why there? Why not study the tropics or some other place in the Mediterranean? And it has to do in part with the Italian heritage and dealing with malarial science. They were very excellent scientists. The British scientists and the Italian scientists were really the leaders in understanding malaria and how to combat it. And also as a temperate place, as a temperate climate, um, it had certain characteristics of it, which in some cases made it more severe and more uh, difficult to deal with than in the tropics, because people would build up these immunities, but which were often temporary, and then because it's a seasonal sort of rush of mosquitoes during the summer season, then they would all catch malaria during that times, and then sometimes they would not be able to continue these immunities for the next season, so then they would get it the next season as well. Whereas if you live in the tropics, sometimes they're continually introduced to the malaria parasite. Therefore, you have a continual exposure and a continual ability to build up some immunities against it. So it's an interesting temperate example of malaria. We had this in the United States too, in California and the southern U.S., but there were maybe more measures, at least initially, to combat that malaria, at least pre-World War II. But so anyway, it's strangely enough, I go into the bit about the history of Sardinia and malaria to get into the issue of what are parasites and what are these parasites doing to us and us to them.
When we go back to the definition, I forgot. I jump around a lot, but I wanted to go back to the epigraph, because that's another thing that readers look at: cover, title, and epigraph. And the epigraph is, I believe, the single most undiagnosed health challenge in the history of the human race is parasites, and that's Dr. Anderson. But then at the same time, in your talk by Joseph Van Beneden, he says, the parasite is he whose profession it is to live at the expense of his neighbor, and whose only employment consists in taking advantage of him, but prudently, so as not to endanger his life. That's two different viewpoints. And you are very careful to explicate both the idea, and then to talk about, because symbiotes and symbiosis also encompasses the parasite. And I didn't really think of it in terms of that. I thought of symbiosis is really nice. They're both taking care of each other. I didn't think of it in this way. So there's two ways of looking at it. One, it's like the worst thing in the world. And then the other thing you posit is that, you know what? It really isn't. It, in a lot of ways, it has moved our civilization forward and doesn't necessarily cause deleterious effects in the long run. It's hard to wrap my head around that. So I guess you ought to explain that. Well, start off, we haven't done it. Start off by talking about, for the lay reader, me, and for the people who are going to buy this book, I guess you got to start off by defining what a parasite is, and then we can get into that.
Correct. I mean, as a historian looking at the issue of parasites, how do you do this? You look at the history of the effects of parasites on human civilization. You look at history of ideas of what we've thought about parasites. You can also look at the history of science, whereby you look at what scientists have done over the years to understand parasites and usually to combat them. More recently, evolutionary biologists and ecologists have gotten into the field of parasitology to see how those creatures are changing ecosystemic processes. So these are different ways of looking at the past to try to figure out what these creatures mean to us. But I think the ambiguity of the definition of parasite really comes from the original parasites. If you look at the etymology of the word, these are Greek relationships that go back a couple of thousand years at least, whereby the parasite is always a human being, and it's a person who ingratiates themselves upon a master or a lord or someone with money or resources, and they live this very actually comfortable relationship where the parasite comes in and lives with this person. But I make the point in the book that this person is offering services in some form, their entertainment or good amusement, so that the lord or the master keeps the parasite on, so that the lord gives resources or food or a good dinner, and the parasite, the human parasite, then reciprocates and gives back. And so that reciprocity that's implied in the Greek parasitological parasitism is somehow lost by the 18th or 19th century, where parasites are transferred to organisms, and the parasite becomes a freeloader, whereby the host then provides resources and the parasite takes those resources and doesn't give them back. So the classical sort of 19th century definition, as you get past helminthology, which is the study of worms, is really a creature that takes but not gives, and various iterations of that definition. Finally, in the 20th century, then parasitology is placed back on human culture, and so people can become parasites, but not in a Greek sense, classical Greek sense, but simply as freeloaders and moochers on the system. And so I get a little bit, some historians have actually tried to use the concept of humans as freeloaders to offer broad brushstrokes of human history. And my best example is William McNeill, whose Plagues and Peoples, this classic book of the 1980s, he at some point in the book talks about macroparasitism, whereby colonialism is almost seen as Europeans going out to the rest of the world and parasitizing other societies, using those resources for themselves and not giving back. But then he says, well, this argument could be more subtle, because in some instances, the parasites, the invading armies would go out and they would plunder and take, but they would not do so completely. They would leave enough resources intact and human societies intact so that they could go back 2 or 3 years later and do it again. And so there was this notion of prudence to take from your host, but make sure that your host does not succumb, does not die. And that's I think the crux of the book is what I think others, but also I mentioned again, call it the parasite's dilemma. And the parasite's dilemma is just how far can you exploit your host? And if you do a full job and are successful at it, then you kill your host, and you therefore eliminate your own livelihood and resources. So you have to be very careful about how far you're able to exploit your host. And in so doing, there's all sorts of feedbacks whereby you have to be very careful about how far you exploit that host. And then you begin to build up this relationship with the host, and the host then begins to consider what sorts of resources, this prudence, if you're giving the host some sort of resources back, what are those resources? What are those benefits? And so I make many arguments and show many examples in the book about how hosts are in fact being compensated by these parasites in some degree, with malaria being the best example. The plasmodium, the little protozoa that lives in malarial person's veins, they have been there for 200,000 years, ever since Homo sapiens have been around. And so the question really becomes, how have they been there so many years without either killing us off completely or us somehow using our immunological systems or our ingenuity to kill off this parasite. So there's been some sort of cohabitation. And if there's been cohabitation, I think one can conjecture that there must be a give and take relationship there, that it must not all be pathogenic in the way some pathogens take only and give nothing up. So I think there's this really important distinction between a pathogen and a parasite. Pathogens get us sick, but a parasite's a relationship.
It's funny because you jumped ahead, which one of the chapters I really wanted to talk about was us as parasites. So you jumped ahead to chapter 6 a little bit, which is fascinating to me because, humans as planetary parasites, is that a metaphor? Is it a fact? I mean, the dodo, the bison, and perhaps the bee, we don't have the same relationship as a parasite does because we get no benefit. In fact, it's a detriment to us to be destroying species at a higher rate than any other time in history. So what does that make us? Is there an ethical host behavior that we should be uh, evidencing? I know I'm jumping ahead, but you did discuss it. And so what are we if we're not receiving a benefit then? Our host, I mean, what we expect to be giving us sustenance of some kind is actually we're destroying it, which is not what a parasite does.
Yeah, I mean, through the thick and thin of the different chapters, I lead up to that's sort of the crux of the book is this ultimate question about humans, our bodies, what are our relationships to other species, and what are our relationships not only to groups of species like communities, but even all of the communities put together, the biosphere. And so I somehow make this after putting all these different arguments on the table. Can we even have a discussion about humans as parasites themselves, or is this somehow, over the top and beyond the topic of a historian or looking at organisms? But as part of this question, I think you have to first of all wonder whether humans can be parasitizing a single organism, and if this single organism is anything, it has to be the whole Earth. And this gets into a discussion of Gaia. And James Lovelock and Margulis thought a lot about an interacting planet Earth as being somehow a holistic unit with feedback mechanisms, and that somehow the creatures within this symbiotic planet, as Margulis called it, all act together to make a better whole. That's the symbiosis thing, whereby everybody benefits. And so a number of these arguments are such that microbes have been producing breathable gases for at least those who go beyond methane and look at and start respiring oxygen. And so other creatures have clearly contributed to a sort of a whole Earth system that makes it more inhabitable or more beneficial. And so if it weren't for some of these creatures, the rest of us would be in a harder shape. So part of that chapter, which was actually a fun one to research and look into, and I try to build the reader up to that one near the end of the book, is determine whether the Earth can be really considered a living being or some sort of a living creature. Is it certainly promotes life, but can the Earth itself or the Gaia system be considered a living being itself? And there's a lot of arguments about whether this can be the case or not. The other issue is a lot of environmentalists and ecologists sort of maybe in an informal way say, oh, humans are parasites. They're sucking out the resources. They're causing such dramatic environmental problems. We are just like parasites, and it's certainly a metaphorical sort of comparison, humans as parasites. But can you actually begin to think of humans in a parasitic role, or let's call it a symbiotic role? And so then the questions becomes if it's a symbiosis, the way I argue many other parasites are on other organisms. If it's a symbiosis, then there has to be this give and take. And so part of that chapter then looks at what have humans done to the earth, and have they always been bad? this is an assumption, mostly it's a historical assumption of the post 19th century, whereby anything that the human hand touches goes. George Perkins Marsh in the 19th century, this is one of his major contributions, as he said, humans really do cause problems. They cause floods, they cut down too many trees, they cause extinctions, etc. But before the 1850s, before sort of the sentiment, there was often this suggestion that people were doing good things to the earth, that they were cultivating, that they could, where they would go, they would set foot, and then the fields would smile with production, and so there's sort of this assumption that humans are not necessarily bad. So you can actually get in, and this is where I borrowed some data from geophysicists and some of the Earth system scientists, looking at what has happened with humanity, what has in terms of altering global systems, and by some measures, humans have created huge amounts of extra productivity through the fields and through all the grazing animals that they've promoted, and crops. So by some measures, we've produced a huge amount of biomass, Homo sapiens, and that at least over the years, and accelerating in the 20th, 21st century.
One of the reasons why the book is so good is because we have this nonfiction book club, and I can just imagine the difference. There'll be some people who say, "How dare you say that human beings are helping the planet? We are destroying it. It's like the home tree in Avatar." And then others saying, "No, we actually have contributed." But it'll be a big argument. Hopefully, it won't come to fisticuffs. But sometimes I long for that in my perverted way. But yeah, there'll be a big argument, and you can see how that would be true, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Europe in my professional career, and the sentiment that when I talk to Europeans generally, not all, of course, but is that humans can do very good things to landscapes and mountainsides, that they can cultivate fields. That I live in Switzerland, and so we love to see manicured meadows, and you can practically go golfing in the high pastures, and that's all because farmers are subsidized to keep those places manicured and green. The sentiment is almost the flip side of that, I think, in North America, whereby we have our golf courses in North America, but true wilderness nature in its best form is in its wilderness. You have to go up to Alaska and places like that to see untrammeled nature. So there's the assumption that humans are a good thing and do good things to the earth on this side of the Atlantic, and on the American side, often the assumption is that we can only ruin things and make things worse. So I was sort of trying to test that sort of that opinion, and to try to figure out whether humans are, in fact, if you look at the measurements in biodiversity and biomass and so on, what has happened in the last 200 or 300 years.
Yeah, it's funny. That leads back into chapter 4, which you title Dreams of Eradication. So you talk about DDT, unintended fallout, and our pride and the idea that, well, as you can see in America now, power is driving everything. Our idea of having the hubris of having the idea that we can control everything.
Yeah.
And so that eradication, or that attempted eradication, how is that going to affect in the long term the biome, Gaia, our own guts internally? How is that going to change things?
Yeah, I mean, we've really become, basically, I think part of it was this germ theory of disease in the 1870s and 80s, so that pretty soon diseases were traced to germs and microbes, and we sort of overreached, whereby we quickly began to think that all germs and all microbes were bad for us. Now, recently we've had a probiotic movement and hygiene hypothesis movement, where we realize we've taken too many antibiotics, and we really could be bringing back some of those microbes that maybe we've lost. But the eradication sort of attempt in the chapter that I write about was the sort of the assumption was that pests, microbes, vectors that carry the pests should all be eliminated, and we do everything we could to get rid of them, from using insecticides to pharmaceuticals. So get rid of all of those. And that was a dream of eradication because we could never really do that. And then people like Rachel Carson wrote her book in response to sort of overdoing this whole movement of too many chemicals. And now we have the integrated pesticide management and integrated programs to try to say, okay, we can take these and use these drugs or pesticides in moderated quantities. But even then, we still are ingesting enormous amounts of chemicals. I was talking with my brother the other day, and he'd heard that something like 5% of our body is now plastic,
Yeah.
plastic particles, or plastic in our brain, plastic. So we live in a modern age, and some of these are self-induced because we're taking all sorts of pharmaceuticals to kill things that are convinced are terrible for us. If you Google my book and look at Parasites, say on Amazon, the first dozen titles that show up are all about parasite scrubs, either books about getting rid of parasites or the actual chemicals, the elixirs themselves, for people trying to get rid of their parasites. There's still this deeply ingrained assumption that things living on us are hurting us, that are bad for us. We want a sterile body, one that, okay, we realize that a few things are good for us, but most of those other critters are bad. And what I try to show in my book is it's a slow discovery of exactly the opposite. Most of the things in our body are very useful to us. And a few of those are pathogens that we have to be careful of.
Yeah, it's funny when you go to a doctor and you have something wrong with you, he's not sure what it is, and he gives you a broad spectrum antibiotic. And it's nice the way this conversation leads into other chapters, because chapter 5 is thinking like a parasite. And I've always thought, some parasite is thinking, these antibiotics really suck. We need to like change our approach here because this is not good for us. So we need to figure out, we can beat this, we can get around this. And they do. And then the antibiotics become essentially placebo.
Especially when you start getting antibiotics for viral diseases, which is about many times, I mean, a good percentage of the times, I think, which is a lost cause. But yeah, a number of people have written about our missing microbes and the issues that those creatures that we ordinarily would have hosted in our bodies have either were never placed there to begin with because we had a cesarean section, or because we've had repeated antibiotic treatments, or just because of our very hyper hygienic, sterile lifestyles that we all live. If you think about the history of the human species, only very recently have we, of course, moved inside or washed our sheets once a week and those sorts of things. So some of those microbes are actually turning out to be very useful. And so really the rest of my book starts talking more about microbes generally, but that's okay because in some definitions of parasites, it's any creature that requires a host or requires another organisms to live on. So that can be everything from a virus to a bacteria to a bigger multi-cellular creature to again back to the discussion about whether humans are parasites or not, um, all the way up. So I think part of the richness of the word is the ambiguity of trying to define what a parasite is. And
It's humbling because, the statistics, like if you put a scale and put us on the other side as the parasites, it's heavier than us. And second is the idea that we're just walking around as bags in which more than half of our stuff inside is parasites, not biological cells that belong to human beings. So that part was really humbling. And it also suggests that, okay, maybe we're not the king of the hill. Maybe we're not the lion, the ones that don't have any predators at all attacking them. And it's like, I've never, I never even thought about it before I read the book. The idea that, maybe we're just here it's like the basis. I've actually read science fiction stories that have that concept, but it does look, it does give you pause to step back and go, wait a minute, I've been looking at all this the wrong way. So books like that are always helpful, I think.
Right, and there have been titles, and exploring our microbiome, and emphasizing the importance of all of these other creatures that are in us, that by cellular count make up a huge fraction, much larger fraction of us than human cells. And so the question then becomes, who are we? What are we? And if we're simply facilitators or mediators for helping all these other creatures grow and live, which is really very much the case, then we have to realize that these big laws of symbiosis, or these trends of symbiosis, hold truth on multiple scales, on bodily scales, on microbial scales, but also on planetary scales. I think one of the really interesting parts of my journey in this book was as I read through the very rich literature on parasitology, it just goes, there's journals and journals and books that the world used to be filled with parasitologists, but now they've branched out into their various specialties. But one was to realize that many parasites themselves are parasitized, so that these creatures, it's really a Russian doll all the way down.
Yeah, it's funny. Why is it that, you have parasites that live in your eyelashes, you have parasites in your head, you have parasites all over your body. And like you said, when you go to bed in your sheets, there's all kinds of little creepy crawlies running around. What is it that gives rise to this visceral, immediate disgust that people feel towards these things? What is that disgust based on? Their shape, the fact that if they were the size of us, they would destroy us in a moment. What is it that gives rise to the disgust?
Yeah, I think part of that disgust is that we've been taught to be repulsed by them. I mean, uh,
Is
we
it
find
have we been taught, or is it
in
an
yeah, is it innate? Is it an innate fear or repulsion of creepy crawlers, or is through our teachings and through the people that we admire, have they told us that these things should be repulsive to us? And I think mostly the answer is we've been taught, because uh, I mentioned in the book shamans and um, traditional societies, or say in China, it was considered, medical people would consider a body to be very healthy indeed if you could find something like 3 or 4 parasites on the body. In other words, you were unhealthy if you didn't carry parasites, or didn't have lice. People would groom each other because they had head lice, and they would pick lice out of each other. But what was really unusual is if you didn't have any lice at all. And that was a sign of an unhealthy person, or a very aged or infirm person. And those parasites would sense when a body was unhealthy, and they would depart that body looking for a healthier one as soon as they could. So there's this assumption there, by observation, is that if you have parasites, you're in good shape, and if you don't, then you'd better be careful.
There's like a cartoon or two in the book, but one of them is like, it's not in the book, but the idea that if someone had the plague, that the lice would get up and pack their suitcases and say, we don't really want to stay here anymore. Things aren't working out well. We'll just take off.
But the counterpoint there is that a medievalist, um, Richard Hoffman, has actually found a lot of archival evidence to suggest that, um, I think was lepers, people with leprosy, if they had, I think they had an amazing ability to avoid, I think it's tuberculosis. Was it tuberculosis? Another very communicable disease, so that there's these interactions between microbes. And so that if you had one disease, then it was very unlikely that you caught another disease. And so this is brought to a point in a number of our illnesses and other types of microbes that we carry. We can actually identify and say, if we have one of these, that may create some sorts of health problems, lesser problems. It will actually counteract another microbe or parasite, which gives us bigger problems. And so there's this interaction between parasites, whereby if you have one, it's a good sign. And I think the best example of that, although it's somewhat contested, is in, again, talking about malaria, there's several Plasmodius species that exist out there, 5 or 6. And if you have one of them, the vivax, as opposed to the falciparum species, the vivax is less virulent. And in many cases, if you've already have the vivax um, um, plasmodium, it helps guard against actually contracting the more virulent species. And so
Yeah, it's
that,
like it's
that
like a vaccine. And the other thing is that you talk about, modern medicine with all of its technological and biological advances. Now, even though it is disgusting to some people, maggots are used to debride necrotic tissue, and leeches are used in a similar fashion. And yet, if you go to a hospital and see this, once again, that disgust raises its head. And here they are being helpers, assisting us.
right. So we've come to the conclusion. Well, sanitation, sanitary
Exactly.
means cleanliness, and sanitation. This is a whole sort of movement in the late 19th century where cleanliness meant healthiness, because you could get rid of all sorts of organisms and creatures and bacteria, which certainly helped. Was a major breakthrough in improving human health. Cleanliness of water, cleanliness of households and garbage disposal, but sanitation was just part of it, and so it was sort of a wholesale, you know, using all sorts of cleaners and all sorts of other pharmaceuticals to basically nuke the body, nuke the streets, get rid of everything. But some of those creatures that were in the garbage piles or on your dog or on your sheets were actually useful. They might have promoted, as I mentioned several times, these these allergic responses where people had these autoimmune diseases, and so now they talk about worm therapy, hookworms being one of the big ones that they actually use to actually inject in people through fecal transplants to help alleviate some of these other problems. And so it's almost black magic. You think, how could worms be helping us with our intestinal worms? How could those be helping us with our autoimmune responses? But the simple fact is, in some cases at least, they're having very good results in fecal transplants, in alleviating people's immune responses and other sorts of anti-immune problems. So,
I remember, like, in the 80s, there was this book, I think it was called The Secret House by a guy named Bodanis or something. And it was about, you go and you use your toothbrush the next morning, or you have no idea what's accumulated in that toothbrush overnight. But the thing you were saying about the human race is that here we are, we've thrived, notwithstanding the fact that we're loaded with all these things that you've made clear are everywhere, are in us, weigh a lot, and outnumber the actual human cells we have in our body. And it's actually made us, I don't know, what's the word? Not better, it's not healthier. What is the word that it's, and you have a chapter devoted to it. What is the word that you could best describe as we conclude, I guess? What's the best word that you can describe that parasites?
well, I think they make, since they're part of communities, then they make our own lives possible because of all the things that they do to us and our domestic animals and our crops. So that communities of creatures, and this is really how I think these are the conclusions that I come to, is not only are they important, but they really make ourselves and our lives and our communities possible. So they make us vigorous, more healthy.
It's one of those words that should be a different word, because it's the word itself that implies that they not only are dangerous, but they could kill us. Yeah, the word parasite is a one-way word. It's not like the word symbiosis that people think, even though it's part of it, people, symbiosis, and they, oh, this is great. We're all cooperating together.
Symbiosis itself has a history as a term, and basically it just means living together, symbiosis.
Right.
And there's long the assumption that because people live together, they must be helping each other, but in some cases they're not. But the next word sort of up from symbiosis would be mutualisms, where each side is actually mutually beneficial to the other. But I think now you talk about symbiosis, and it's I think a synonym for mutualism, but it also originally began as simply living together, and then your question is, if these two things are living together, what are they doing to each other? Are they simply can you really coexist and not have an effect on the other creature? And my argument is I think not. If you're sitting there right next to each other, you're going to have some effect, and that effect has to be either good or bad.
Well, the thing about the way I'm leaving this book, and maybe you can tell me, I know basically you're a historian, I understand that, but you know, the old cliche, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. You know, I'm leaving the book thinking, okay, this is what I'm pondering, and this is the rabbit hole I'll go down and research and talk to my customers about, and the people who comment on this interview. Is like, I'm leaving the book somewhat, not, you know, not confused, because you don't do anything confusing. I'm leaving the book somewhat like of two minds. Did you intend that? I don't know. You didn't intend that. What did you, and this is a cliche-ish question too. What would you like? What did you intend? What did you hope that readers would take away from reading this book?
Probably the biggest issue is, as I got deeper into the book, is just to appreciate your parasites and to realize that most
Right.
of the parasites in us or on us are actually beneficial to us. They're we have this assumption that parasites are bad, and in fact, that's not the case.
Yeah, the
That's
funny thing about it is that pushed me into this, and now I leave thinking, okay, do I feel like that? Do I really feel like they're,
you really want to go out and start ingesting worms and
yeah,
not sheets.
exactly.
One can maybe use fewer parasite scrubs, or one can also uh, blame their ailments and their problems less on microbes and parasites than on other issues. Maybe that's part of the problem.
Well, it's
Uh,
funny with the demographic of my bookstore. I can, and I'm old, but I can imagine the little old ladies who come in and I show them the book and they go, ugh, and they get, ugh.
we probably shouldn't have put a parasite on the front cover, but a happy face or some sort of healthy face. No, I think another issue that for historians, this would be an important book, is that the old assumption that we transferred microbes around the world and across continents, and those killed basically Europeans, inflicted things like smallpox on the rest of the world. Well, actually, not smallpox because that came from the New England, but inflicted measles and all of the other things on the rest of the world, and they succumbed to those. But if you can look at that really as uh, Europeans or old world peoples building up immunities to these diseases and then going overseas as this mutualist duo, host and parasite, then it's really the parasite helping the host, and together they're defeating their enemies and conquering the world. So it really becomes a project of mutualism and symbiosis rather than just inflicting diseases. So
Yeah,
I'm trying to
but you
rethink.
have to be able to be the kind of person who steps back and can look at the macro versus the micro aspect of history.
Well, big populations, but also on an individual scale. And I mentioned a number of ways that parasites help us. So, yeah, the take-home message is, if you hate parasites and think that if you find lice, I know people are constantly battling lice in their, I did with our kids' scalps, or
Yeah,
or or whatever other issue it is. Rethink some of that, because I don't pretend to give medical advice with this book, but I do think we need to to question some of our assumptions about what these creatures are doing to us,
I
and
know. I'm thinking,
thinking
well,
that things are
maybe
bad.
after reading this book, maybe I shouldn't take a shower every day, and maybe I shouldn't shampoo what little hair I have left every day. Maybe I'll be healthier. So have
Well,
taken.
in some cases that may be true. We're still waiting for the microbiologists and the parasitologists to start giving definitive evidence and showing us the chemical equations and so on that show that cause A equals B. But by the time we wait for all of those definitive answers, we'd better use some basic common sense and look at some of the historical examples.
And I think I will have run that course by the time I'll be out of here before any of that happens. Well, Marcus, thank you so much for doing this. It was a great book, you know, and I really enjoyed the fact that and this is another reason why books sell, is that like the chapters were somewhat whimsical. There was this touch of humor in it and that propels you to the next page. And I think that was very smart. I think that was well done. So thanks again for writing it, and thanks for talking to me today.
And I think the reaction books and also the editors that pushed me in those directions too. So it's been a very good experience. Well, thanks for having me on then. And I hope, I hope we get some, I hope the books can make it to the bookstore, which in the next few weeks, apparently through you or Chicago Press, they're sending those out.
They'll be in my store anyway. That's as good as I can do for you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sam. Have a great evening, day, whatever it is. Okay, thanks. Bye bye.